So he's come over from Raleigh to be with us today. And I was joking with him a little earlier, he is our spotlight speaker today. Wants to give us some insights on our region's economy and our labor market. So Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. It is an honor and a privilege, and dare I say a pleasure, to be here with all of you. As was just mentioned, I drove all the way out here from Raleigh, North Carolina this morning. Took me about 4 hours, which tells you that I'm about at least 4 hours removed from your day-to-day experience that you all are seeing living and working here in Western North Carolina in the French Broad River Valley. I'm not even from North Carolina originally, as you can probably tell from my accent. I was born and raised in New York City, although I've lived in the Carolinas for some time. While what I'm going to be telling you today is no replacement for your day-to-day, on-the-ground experience, what you see with your customers, it is perhaps another perspective, hence the title, Perspectives. I spend a lot of time in my job collecting data, analyzing data, using these data to help try to understand regional economies in our state. And I want to walk you through some things that I've noticed about your region. Agree with me or disagree with me, please feel free to raise your hands if I say anything that's too out of whack or that you feel I'm not providing the proper perspective. But hopefully this, as a secondary benefit, will help show you how folks like me and perhaps how folks like you can use existing economic and labor market data to tell stories about your region and perhaps even inform your workforce and economic development strategy. So scope and some key questions. Geographic area, we're going to talk about the Asheville labor market. I'm not specifically talking about the French Broad River Valley. I'll explain exactly what I mean in a minute. And an undercurrent that runs throughout this presentation is the jobs that exist in the Asheville area labor market and the wages that they pay. It's a stereotype, perhaps an unfair stereotype, although not entirely, that the jobs in this region pay relatively low wages, or even perhaps relative to other regions. Well, is this the case? And if it is the case, why? I want to try to tell that story a little bit with some data. And I also want to try to keep this practical. Given what I'm telling you about the economy, well, what can we do about it? Within the workforce system, the education system, the economic development system, what is our comparative advantage as a region? How are we competing? What are we doing well at? How can we continue to meet the needs of workers for employment, for career-sustaining employment, as well as the needs from employers for labor that can help feed the sustainability of their business and the profitability of their business. And also overall, this average wage number that we have in Asheville, how can we boost that? What development strategies could we put into play that could raise the overall wage earnings of workers in this region? So what do I mean by the Asheville labor market? While I'm kind of at the mercy of the data sources that I'm working with, several of the data sources that I was able to get access to are only available at the metropolitan statistical area level. So French Broad River, leave out Transylvania County, insert Haywood County, and you've got the MSA. But one way or the other, from a labor market perspective, we're talking about Asheville in terms of the bulk of the jobs, with perhaps Henderson County, of course, representing also a substantial number of jobs. But about 69% of the jobs in the MSA came from Buncombe County. So for shorthand, I call this the Asheville labor market. You can call it the Asheville, Hendersonville, Mint Hill labor market. Most of the jobs are here in Buncombe County. Some of the other data I'm going to show you cover the broader Western Prosperity Zone region, which is, of course, a much larger administrative region of the state, still, from an economic perspective, centered in Asheville. 71% of the jobs in the Western region are from the Asheville metropolitan statistical area. So again, shorthand, Asheville economy, and of course talking about many counties, each of which have their own individual strengths and weaknesses. So some of the data sources I'm going to walk you through include some data that's put out by our analysis division of the North Carolina Department of Commerce, or LEAD. The first data source is going to be current employment statistics. This is, when you turn on the radio and it says employers added this many jobs this month. That's what I'm talking about, the so-called payroll survey. This is our most current indicator of how many jobs we got right now, right? How fast they're growing and what industries they're turning up in. So it can be kind of useful information. Although because it's such a current measure, there do tend to be revisions, as Nathan knows. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. I'm going to present some data from the Census Bureau's quarterly workforce indicators, which is much less timely. It has a lag of about a year and a half, but it provides some really, really detailed data on workforce dynamics, including the dynamics of wage earning. And I think some of that information is really helpful for understanding what's going on with Asheville's average wage. I'm going to talk a little bit about some data that LEAD just put up on our website within the last year, looking at the supply of labor and the demand for labor in your area. So essentially the number of job seekers versus the number of job openings, right? What types of jobs do you need more people applying for, and which areas do you maybe have a labor surplus? These data can help answer that type of question. Again, very different from just the number of jobs. Here we're asking which jobs are most, quote unquote, in demand. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the outcomes of students coming through your area's public university system and community college system. There's a website we maintain called nctower.com if you're ever interested. Anybody who ever went to a public university or community college in North Carolina back to 2003, we can tell you what they're earning up to now. So for 2003 graduates, we know how they're doing in the labor market 15 years later. Very, very interesting longitudinal information. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the broader context of this presentation. So let's get into it. What is the Asheville Advantage, or as economists might say, comparative advantage? What do you automatically do more productively, better than everybody else? Well, let's just talk about the economy in general. It's growing. It's growing relatively rapidly. Alongside your relatively rapid population growth, you have relatively rapid job growth, as well as a very tight labor market. And what I mean by that is a relatively small number of job seekers per job opening. So really, the Asheville area is, in a lot of respects, a job seekers market. It offers a lot of opportunity for individuals who are looking for a job. There's just more opportunities out there for them. And specifically, the region has comparative advantage very strongly in healthcare, a historical advantage in that respect, and in, of course, tourism and retirement-related activities. There are several historical as well as natural advantages. I don't talk as much about manufacturing. Manufacturing is, of course, an area that this region concentrates in, but that doesn't make it very much different from the rest of North Carolina. North Carolina is a very manufacturing-intensive state. Asheville area, not necessarily that much more so than other areas. But healthcare, accommodation, food services, y'all are just popping off the charts for both historical reasons as well as natural reasons. So historically, this has been a center for healthcare service provision in Western North Carolina. We also have a legacy of a historic downtown, historic structures and landmarks such as Biltmore, and of course the mountains and the parks and the weather, and a long-standing food, arts, and music culture. These are the kinds of things that that money can't necessarily buy. Y'all have it, and you have it in spades. And what's interesting is that your jobs are more concentrated in these areas, and in these areas, the jobs also pay more than elsewhere in the state. There's a couple of economic forces at work, one being comparative advantage. Because you do these things better, your companies are more profitable, and they can pay more. And another thing at work is labor market tightness. Because there's such a need for workers in these areas, wages get bid up a little bit. So just to show you in data what we're talking about, here are over-the-year job growth rates mapped out from before the recession to after the recession. And as you can see, Asheville, which is the purple line, has pretty much been neck and neck with the North Carolina state average for much of this period. Although certainly since 2015, the Asheville purple line has been higher, has been growing faster than the rest of the state. Most recent number over the year, job growth for the Asheville metropolitan area, 2.4% compared to 1.7% statewide. And over the last several years, over the year job growth in Asheville has been between 2.5%, 4%, whereas for the rest of the state, it's been more like 1%, 2%. North Carolina is a relatively fast-growing state, and within our state, Asheville is growing even faster. And another side of this, is looking at the tightness of the labor market. So here what we have is the number of job seekers per job opening. Think of this in a similar way as the unemployment rate, right? But this is a more direct measure of the tightness of the labor market. For those people who are looking for work, for each individual, how many opportunities are out there? So as you can see in both Asheville and North Carolina, we're now much higher than we were at the height of the recession when there were around 10 job seekers per job opening. Now there's less than 2, right? And we're even tighter than we were before the Great Recession, when there were as many as 3.5 job seekers per job opening. So when employers are telling you this is the hardest hiring environment that I've seen in 10 years, or maybe even by implication 20 years, this is something that the data bears out. But even more so in Asheville. Asheville has a tighter labor market than the rest of the state. Asheville's job mix is concentrated in healthcare and accommodation and food services. As you can see, 20% of Asheville's jobs fully are in healthcare and social assistance versus 14% of the statewide. Very much a healthcare-centered area. Accommodation and food services, 15% out here compared to 12% statewide. And as a result, as I explained before, you see higher wages. So in Asheville, for both of these sectors, the average monthly wage is about 10% higher than you'd see statewide. So to some extent, when people say Asheville has low wages, well, it depends which sector you're talking about, right? Well, let's get to some of those other sectors. So probably overall challenge facing this region from a workers' desirability perspective, why wouldn't you want to live in Asheville? Well, the reason that comes up in my conversations with people is that on average, the jobs are relatively low pay. Well, why might that be the case? Well, some of it is just a result of your natural geographic barriers to growth. You'll never be a large, sprawling city. You'll always be a mid-sized city because of those mountains, right? Those mountains are a blessing and a curse from an economic development perspective. And you know the story these days. It's the bigger cities that are getting those big industries and those higher paying jobs. And that's probably always been the case to a certain extent, now more so than ever. Oh, I'm sorry. Hit the wrong button. And we also have generally a concentration in sectors that overall are lower paying. Accommodation and food service, generally lower paying. Healthcare, a mix of higher paying and lower paying jobs, and probably around average overall. But not only that, we also have a shortage in this region, you could say, of large companies. Now, I don't necessarily mean like large establishments, right? You know, big boxy factory buildings. I mean like Fortune 500 companies, the type of large international organizations that are highly productive, that pay a lot. We also don't have a lot of that over here in Asheville. And one more thing, for those that we do have, those professional technical service jobs, those large employers, they pay less out here. Why is that the case? Again, a couple of economic forces at work, one of them comparative advantage. If this isn't going to be the center of that activity, well then it's also not going to be where the most high paying version of that activity is, right? Because Asheville isn't specialized in those areas. And labor market slack also plays a role. There's not as much of a shortage of workers in these areas as there is in leisure hospitality. And I'll show you some data to flesh out those stories in a little bit. So looking at the wage gap between the Asheville MSA and North Carolina statewide average, well, kind of depends what data source you look at. It ranges anywhere from around 18% from sources of data that are collected at the quarterly or the monthly level to around 7% of those sources of data that are collected at the hourly level. So while there are some like maybe methodology differences between these data sources, a lot of it is just about the time period covered. So of course, a lot of the jobs in the Asheville area, part-time perhaps, maybe not 40 hours a week, maybe not 4 to 5 weeks per month. So part of the effect here is just the jobs that are here, people are working fewer hours at them. But then again, even at an hourly level, folks are getting paid less out here in Asheville than the statewide average. Why might that be the case? Well, here's a graph looking at on this axis down here is jobs. That axis on the left is the monthly wage. So up here in this corner, that's Charlotte. Got a lot of jobs and also some of the highest wages in the state. Go a little further down the side, you see Raleigh. Almost as many jobs as Charlotte, also some of the highest paying jobs in the state. And that cluster over there in the bottom left-hand corner, that includes Asheville. That's all of our smaller metro areas. And frankly, if you put all the metro areas in our country on a graph like this, you'd see similar figures. More jobs, larger cities, they tend to be more productive, they tend to pay higher wages. There's some fundamental economic dynamics going on here. If we take a similar graph, but instead plot on this side the share of all jobs, Asheville versus North Carolina, and on the other side the wage, we see that right here in this quadrant, the jobs that Asheville is concentrated in, accommodation and food services, maybe a little bit retail trade, these are all in the lower section, right? These are all lower paying jobs. All the way on that left-hand side, finance, insurance, professional, scientific, technical services, those are all areas in which Asheville is very, very, very much not concentrated, and those are the highest paying jobs. This is just another way of showing you what I was explaining before. And even for those areas where we should expect to see high wages, like large companies and their management of company establishments, so headquarters, regional headquarters of large companies, research firms, finance firms, Asheville has a smaller share than we see statewide. And what you also see is that for those areas, the wages are substantially lower in Asheville. So for these jobs that otherwise would be considered high-paying jobs, they're not as high-paying in Asheville, partly because the concentration is so low. We haven't yet seized a comparative advantage in these areas in Asheville. I'm going to give you another perspective which helps flesh out this story about wage earning in the region, and then we'll talk about some perhaps constructive solutions and look at some more data sources that can help inform those solutions. Excuse me. So as I mentioned before, we can look at data from those that graduated from area universities in 2003 and look at where they ended up 14 years later. And if you compare UNC Asheville, our liberal arts campus, and Western Carolina University to the UNC average, you see that in the few years after graduation, they were all about neck and neck, but something started to change. In the 6th, 7th year after graduation, maybe people's late 20s where they're evolving, maturing into their careers, there's a divergence. And by the 14th year, the average graduate of a UNC system campus is making around $67,000, whereas graduates from our area campuses are only making around $55,000. Why is that the case? I mean, don't we have good schools out here? Don't we have a good quality of education? Well, yes, we do. But some of the dynamics that I walked through in the earlier slides are also at play here. So why are the students not doing as well in the labor market? It's a mix of what they majored in, so the skills that they got and maybe the types of jobs that they'd be most qualified for. UNC Asheville, of course, very liberal arts heavy. Western Carolina, there are a bunch of folks who majored in Homeland Security, law enforcement. At this time, neither of these campuses were graduating students from their engineering program, right? So part of it is just that these were individuals graduating from college with a 4-year degree, right? But perhaps not the skills that get them the highest paying jobs. But it's more than that. It's also where they live. So of those employed 14 years out, the majority of them came back to live in the Western region, which is great, right? I mean, we want our kids coming home. We want our human capital to stay where it was raised. But they came back home to perhaps lower paying jobs than they might have gotten if they were working in Charlotte and Raleigh. Only about 6%. Only about a quarter went to the Triangle or the Charlotte region to get a job versus the majority of those UNC kids. So a few things at work here. Skills equals dollars, but also regional economies can make a lot of difference regarding how much money somebody is able to make in their career. So what can be done? What are some strategies for workforce and economic development? Well, I'm not a strategy person, I'm just a data person, right? That's my disclaimer. You all here know what you are best equipped to do to move the needle on some of these topics, but I think it's useful to talk in general about broad types of economic development and workforce strategy. One of them is, I call the safe bet. Focus on what you already got and what you already do well. And that means strengthening existing industry clusters in areas like healthcare and hospitality. And what do I mean by an industry cluster? I mean the talent pool. I mean the physical infrastructure. I mean the programs at your area community colleges and universities, the social networks, the individual relationships, all of the connective tissue that you need in a regional economy to make a certain sector be competitive. That's what I mean by cluster. Some of that we can control, some of that we can't. But that's what you do to strengthen the advantage that you already have in your area, as well as training students to meet the existing demand in those fields. And our goal here is basically to keep doing what we're already doing well, even better. To help employers with the need that they have right now for jobs, and to help students and job seekers find work in the region, not have to leave the region. One of the drawbacks of this is that story I told at the beginning part of the presentation, that doesn't change. We're still locked into a relatively low-wage industry mix in this region, if we go with the safe bet. And then there's the gamble, which, per its term, can have some high upsides, but also some downsides. And what we want to do here is build a new comparative advantage, become known for doing other things better than anybody else does it. Building new industry clusters, training students to meet the demand in these fields. Even if the jobs in these fields aren't in Asheville yet, right? If you build it, they will come. That's what they said in that movie. And the goals are, of course, to shift to a higher paying, higher productivity economy, and to attract and retain those employers that have those jobs of the future that are paying those higher wages. On the drawbacks, what if you build it and it doesn't come, right? For every research triangle park, we have I might get in trouble for saying this, a global trans park, right? Our state's history and our country's history are full of economic development incentives, some of which are very, very, very profitable in the long term, and some of which might not be or might take a very, very long time to mature. So it is a gamble to build the infrastructure, to develop the new programs, to produce the labor pool that's needed for an industry that might not exist in your region yet. And in the meantime, some of those kids coming out of school with those skills, if the jobs aren't in the Asheville region, they might have to leave for a time being. So that's the gamble. So let's look at some data that can help inform both sides of these choices. Talk a little about our data on labor supply and demand that we just published. The supply-demand rate, which is what I showed you before, the number of job seekers per job opening, is just a way of measuring the tightness in the labor market. A tight labor market, one where there's not that many job seekers per job opening, we might call that a in-demand labor market. That's a situation where you have plenty of jobs, or at least plenty of job openings. The employer demand is there, but perhaps the labor supply, the people, are not there yet. That's a tight labor market. A slack labor market is the opposite of that. You got a lot of people, but perhaps not as many job openings. So that's a situation in which you might not necessarily need more workers, but need more jobs. And we're going to be talking in the context of career clusters. Career clusters, it's a way to describe groups of occupations that exist within given industries. So just think about them as industries. I can answer more specific questions if folks have. So looking at the hospitality and tourism career cluster, which has a lot of overlap with the accommodation and food service industry. The Western region has a relatively tight labor market in the area. So only 2.6 job seekers per job opening compared to 3.2 statewide. This is one of the reasons why our leisure and hospitality jobs pay more, because we have more of a labor shortage in that area. Similar health science, 1.2 job seekers per job opening versus 1.3 statewide. A little tighter than we are statewide, very, very, very tight in that area. When we break it out by education level, we see a lot of the health science jobs, a lot of the opportunities are concentrated at the below BA or perhaps post-secondary community college level, associate's level, certificates. There are a lot of opportunities in the health science field in Asheville for students with that background, and we have a relatively tight labor market in Asheville for workers with that type of background. So what type of programs am I talking about in particular? Programs that prepare students for jobs in radiology, in dental hygiene, in occupational therapy, even registered nursing. And I know that's a political question of whether or not that's an associate's or a bachelor's level job. But these are all the types of educational programs that right now, or 2 years upon completion of the program, can help your folks get good middle class jobs that are very much in demand in this region. That's the safe bet. You can't lose. Here's the gamble. Now some of these career clusters, finance, STEM, business management, information technology, these are the types of jobs that exist in those high-paying sectors that I was talking about before, where Asheville doesn't have a large concentration. Now you'll notice here that for those areas, the Western region has a relatively slack labor market compared to the rest of the state. So for example, in information technology, 7 job seekers per IT job opening in the Western region compared to 1.8 statewide. One might look at these data and say, well, that means we don't need any more workers in these areas. If we produce workers for these fields, why won't they just leave Asheville? Why won't they go to another part of the state that has a tighter labor market in these areas? Well, that is the gamble. If you produce more workers in these areas, it will make you more competitive. This kind of information can be attractive to employers because they know that they can go to Asheville and have better negotiating leverage, a larger labor pool for these areas. But what you really need is the jobs. You need to use the people as a recruiting tool to get the companies, because otherwise you're going to continue to have slack labor markets in these areas, and those jobs will continue to pay less, partly because of those conditions. And a lot of the opportunities in these areas are concentrated at the higher ed level. So we're not talking about community college anymore. We're talking about BAs and bachelors and above. So that is the type of talent that these types of companies are desiring. But again, for the time being, we have a relative shortage of opportunities in this region for those types of jobs. So we have kind of a chicken-egg problem if we want to push our economy into that area. Okay, something went wrong with that slide. But what's interesting in general is that you look at all jobs that require a bachelor's degree. The Western region has a relatively slack labor market. So it's tight overall. We really, really need people. But in terms of the jobs mix we currently have, we don't need BA or higher educated workers so much as the rest of the state. Now you want to turn that around. You want to build the labor demand for those types of people because you have those people, and these are the types of jobs that pay the highest. But they're not here right now. And that's why it is a gamble to invest in some of these higher skill, high education areas in this region. And some of the specific programs that we're talking about in finance, accounting, financial management provide a lot of the fundamental skills for a career in finance. Industrial engineering is a very good program to start with in the STEM cluster, as a lot of our applications in North Carolina are in a manufacturing or an industrial environment. And of course, there are opportunities that predominate for both business management as well as IT. I'm going to take a little bit to use these data to talk about manufacturing, not to go too off course here. I'll make it quick. This has been a really banner year for the manufacturing sector in the Asheville MSA, and these are over-the-year job growth rates for manufacturing. Asheville has been growing faster in manufacturing jobs than the statewide average since at least 2016, and over the last year has grown 7% over the year. These are giant numbers. And as far as I can tell from the data, a lot of this is coming from transportation equipment manufacturing, to some degree food manufacturing, but really it's a broad-based manufacturing resurgence in this area. So what types of manufacturing jobs are most in demand? Well, there's kind of a right now perspective and a historical perspective, and I want to share that with you because I think this is very interesting. So, Western region, relatively tight labor market for manufacturing workers. So I would consider manufacturing perhaps under the rubric of the safe bet. It's something that you're already doing out here, and it's something that employers have a need for more than statewide. And when you look at the types of jobs that exist within the manufacturing career cluster, it can be organized kind of as follows. You have production jobs. These are usually, but not always, lower skill, routine type work, assemblers, machine operators. You also have maintenance and installation and repair, which is self-explanatory, as well as manufacturing production process development, which is primarily engineering technicians. So these first two categories, less routine, very often require the attainment of higher level education credentials. Those are tighter labor markets. They only have about 1.1, 1.2 job seekers per job opening, whereas the market for production jobs, more routine, is more slack at about 3.6 job seekers per job opening. But Mr. Economist, I hear you say, I run a manufacturing business and I hear this all the time. I need ground level factory floor workers. I need those assemblers. I need those machine operators. I'm having a harder time than I have in a really long time. Well, you're also right. So let's look at the historical perspective. So looking historically at these types of jobs, production, installation, maintenance, and engineering, we see that over time, production has in general been a slacker labor market. But where it is right now is much tighter than it was at the height of the recession. There are about 10 times fewer job seekers per job opening for those production jobs, assemblers, et cetera, than there were during the Great Recession. Moreover, there were 6.3 job seekers per job opening before the recession. So even before the recession, there was more labor available in this market than there is now. So yes, those employers that are saying it's harder than it was in 20 years, the data do bear that out. That is true. And what's also true is these other areas, installation and maintenance, engineering, they're tight, but they've always been tight. They were tight before the Great Recession. They didn't get that slack during the Great Recession. So those are areas that from one perspective perhaps might be more in demand than production occupations. On the other side, from a historical perspective, there's so much more demand for production occupations than there were 10 to 20 years ago that this is going to be really disruptive to the business models of our manufacturing employers. So a couple of different perspectives. One more sidebar before I leave you. My colleagues didn't want me to go away without letting you know that we just released a new set of data on employment projections, as well as our star jobs recommendations, which is just a simplified way to tell various regions of the state what the most promising occupations are, the ones that are growing fast, the ones that pay the most. And I'll walk you through just a couple of highlights from those data for the Asheville region. We were talking about healthcare. We were talking about accommodation and food service. Well, and I'm sorry, I don't know what happens to those values. Something must have happened on my presentation. There were numbers on there before, I promise. I think we're projected, if my memory serves me correctly, to add about 5,000 jobs in healthcare and about 3,000 jobs in accommodation in this area over the next decade. So these continue to be areas in which we will need a lot of people, and I imagine those labor markets will continue to tighten unless, God forbid, we have a recession, which is another story. Looking in terms of, percentage growth, in this region, professional, technical, and scientific services is actually projected to grow much faster than the average job. So that was one of the higher paying areas that I said we somewhat lacked in this region. It appears that we are projected to catch up over time. That's good news. Slower growing projected is finance, as well as management of companies, those headquarters, those regional offices. If nothing changes, those aren't projected to grow as fast in this region. And getting back to the jobs within manufacturing issue, we predict that engineering occupations, installation, maintenance, that these will grow relatively rapidly in the future, but that production occupations won't. They tend to be more routine. They tend to be more automatable. Our experience from history has there's been a tremendous decline in the number of production jobs over the last generation. Doesn't necessarily mean that that will be the case in the future, but our best guess based on historical trends is that this is where the manufacturing field is going, toward more non-routine, high-value, high-skilled jobs, and perhaps away, gradually, from those more routine jobs. So in summary, things that you already know, Asheville is great, Asheville is rapidly growing. Overall, though, on average, relatively low-paying jobs, a low average wage. In terms of path forward, we can follow the safe bet and double down on the existing advantages that we have in this region, and those advantages are substantial, including a number of opportunities, particularly at the below BA level, in the health science field, but really at all levels for health science. A more aggressive strategy might be to build new comparative advantage in new high-paying areas, including a lot of BA level opportunities in IT, STEM, professional and business services, some of which we were talking about before. But again, if you train the workers, will there be jobs in this region for them to enter with those newly minted skills? Something to think about. That's all I have for you right now, and I'd be glad to take any questions right now or afterward. Thank you for your time.